Hey everyone, it's Alex the Real Mr. Robinson, and welcome back to my chronological recap of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and this is part 13. Lucky number 13, as we are talking about one of the more controversial MCU films, maybe not as much as Iron Man 3, but we're talking about Avengers Age of Ultron. Now, last time I talked about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 and how much I wasn't a huge fan of it when it came out. I said it was good but not great, but then seeing it again, I absolutely loved it, and one of my top 10 MCU films. Age of Ultron kind of follows a similar beat, but in reverse. I remember back in the day seeing this movie in theaters and was like, yeah, it's not as good as the first Avengers, but I still love it a lot, and I gave it my highest rating. Get off your ass and go see it right now. But having rewatched it just recently, I'm like, yeah, maybe that was a bit too much in terms of praise. I don't dislike this movie at all. I don't think it's as bad as people are making it out to be, and I don't even think it's a bad movie. It's just not as great as the first Avengers. There's actually quite a bit about this movie that I really like. With the characters, they're all the same characters from the first Avengers. Yeah, Tony Stark, Steve Rogers, Thor, Bruce Banner, aka the Hulk, Natasha Romanoff, Clint Barton. So the characters are pretty much the same, but there is a little more development with some of them. Sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's something that people have an issue with when it comes to this movie. I want to start out with the character that I think gets probably the most development in this movie, and that's Clint Barton, because in the first Avengers, he was not himself throughout most of the movie. He was under Loki's mind control. In this movie, we get to see more of his personality. We get to see more of the true Clint Barton, and this is the movie that introduces us to his family. There's a point in this movie where the Avengers have pretty much been defeated by Ultron in more ways than one, and they go to a safe house, which ends up being Clint's family farm. And it's at this point where we get to really know more about Clint Barton. It's a time for our heroes to actually relax and kind of calm down after what they just went through. And we get to see that while Clint may just be a human being compared to a super soldier, a billionaire with an iron suit, a god, and a rage monster, he still sticks among them because it's his duty to save the world. He is one of the core Avengers, and in a way, he represents the heart. That's one of the reasons why a lot of people say the Avengers lost in Infinity War, was because Hawkeye wasn't there among them. I don't think that's the ultimate reason, but I like that idea. And this movie right here definitely reinforces that theory about Infinity War. He's the one that really brings this extraordinary group to a more grounded level. I feel like even more than Natasha Romanoff, because he's a family man. And let's actually get into Natasha Romanoff, because one of the big complaints that people have about this movie is that Joss Whedon tried to build a relationship, a romantic one, with her and Bruce Banner. Once again, played by Mark Ruffalo, they didn't have to change actors again. And with my complete honest opinion about this relationship, I honestly don't have an issue with it, because this movie came out on the heels of Winter Soldier, last time we saw Natasha Romanoff. So throughout this movie, she's trying to find a way to kind of be more of a normal person, because her whole life has been dedicated to being a spy and working for an agency that ended up being nothing but a giant lie. And she's trying to find her place in the world. I honestly think it's a nice way to make Natasha Romanoff a little bit more human, because throughout the other movies, she was just this very tough, pretty much emotionless spy, which, not a problem, because that's her job, to be tough. But like with Clint Barton and him being a family man, this trait for Natasha Romanoff makes the character feel a lot more grounded. And plus, it was a romance that was never going to work out from the start, because with Bruce Banner, he's a guy that can't get romantically involved, because even though he managed to control the Hulk at the end of The Incredible Hulk and throughout the Avengers, there are some points where the Hulk could just completely take over and Bruce Banner is not in control. So he can't be in a romantic relationship with anyone. That's why he abandoned Betty Ross, because she needs to be safe, but also Natasha has to be safe, just in case there's a point where the Hulk becomes so enraged that he doesn't recognize anybody. And again, it was a romance that was doomed from the start, so I honestly didn't have a problem with this like so many other people. Now let's talk about Tony Stark, because he is the one that is responsible for this whole movie happening due to him creating Ultron. And yeah, people could blame him for that, and this is one of the few reasons why people often cite Tony Stark as being a true villain within the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I don't get that. Yeah, he's done some stupid things, especially with this right here, but I actually understand why he's doing it. Because he's doing this out of fear because of a vision that he was shown thanks to one of the newer characters, Wanda Maximoff, aka the Scarlet Witch. Because ever since the Battle of New York in the first movie, he's been prepping himself for an oncoming alien invasion. That's why he built all those Iron Man suits, and with this vision, his fears have come back that he might not have done enough on his part to make the team as strong as it was, and he was responsible for the team's downfall. So the opening of the movie involves the Avengers storming a Hydra base run by Baron von Strucker to take Loki's scepter, which houses the Mind Stone, and he uses the scepter in order to create Ultron and possibly retire the Avengers so that Ultron could take over, but obviously that doesn't work out. But I don't think it's really enough to say that, oh, he's the villain. Because, no, you see that his intentions are good, it's just they're a little misguided. Now let's talk about the actual villain of the film, Ultron. A lot of people don't seem to like Ultron as a villain, and I can kind of see why, because his origin is not the same as in the comics. In the comics, he was created by Hank Pym, and in this, he's created by Tony Stark and Bruce Banner, which, whatever, I mean, I don't mind, because the intention for his creation is still the same, to be a peacekeeping force. And with all stories involving artificial intelligence, Ultron becomes self-aware and decides that humanity's not worth keeping alive. But in his mind, he thinks he's saving the world by getting rid of humanity and basically having life start over again. And James Spader, who voices Ultron, does a really good job. He might have a few too many quirky Joss Whedon quips, but I think with the tone of his voice and a lot of the monologues that Ultron delivers makes him sound incredibly menacing. And he's also tough as well. He's not a pushover when it comes to fighting the Avengers. And maybe not physically, but he's just so much smarter than the rest of the team because he's a computer, he can get into any system and basically be one step ahead of the Avengers. So that's what makes him an intimidating threat, along with two new characters, Pietro and Wanda Maximoff, aka Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. There's honestly not a whole lot to these two characters within this first movie. We get to see a lot more of Wanda as the series goes along, but in here they start off as being villains because they volunteered for Hydra's human experimentations with the scepter, and then they join Ultron because they want revenge against the Avengers, particularly Tony Stark back in his arms dealing days. But then they suddenly side with the Avengers knowing that Ultron would inevitably destroy the world despite him thinking that he's saving it. And again, there's not a whole lot to these two characters within this movie. They don't get a whole lot of depth. They do have some backstory on why they have so much anger towards Tony Stark and why they're the only two humans that survived Strucker's experiments. And again, not a whole lot, especially when it comes to Pietro, because X-Men Days of Future Past, which also featured their own version of Quicksilver, Peter Maximoff, came out the year before and did Quicksilver so much better in that movie than this one. Although, technically, if you count the Winter Soldier mid-credits stinger, this Quicksilver came out first. But yeah, this Quicksilver is not as interesting as the one in X-Men, and when this movie made a huge deal about one Avenger would be dying, the whole movie had it set up to where Clint Barton was going to be the one to die. And when we ultimately find out that Pietro's the one that bites the dust, I'm just like, oh, really? Okay, that's underwhelming, but whatever. So yeah, what I'm describing is kind of a mixed bag. There's a lot of good stuff as well, but also some mediocre stuff. Two things I didn't mention in terms of characters were Thor and Steve Rogers. Both of these characters don't really have much to do either. Steve Rogers does get a little bit of an arc carried over from Winter Soldier where he's trying to figure out his place in the world, and by the end of the movie, he figures out that his place is with the Avengers, leading the team, and that's what he considers to be his new home. So it's a nice little arc between two movies, but with Thor, they really do nothing with this character. Chris Hemsworth still does a really good job, and there's a great scene right before Ultron pops up where the team members are trying to lift Thor's hammer, and that right there, in the way Chris Hemsworth portrays Thor, is one of the other few moments that would be a precursor to the Thor we would get in Ragnarok. And it's a fun scene, but outside of that, Thor is just there to kind of set up future events, to inform us about that Infinity War is coming, and he just doesn't serve much of a purpose in this movie outside of being Thor. So yeah, there's some mediocre stuff in this movie, but there's also a lot of good stuff here as well. The action's a lot of fun, especially the Hulkbuster fight. The Hulkbuster fight in this movie is just so raw, so badass, well choreographed. It's the best action scene in the entire movie, and it's got a really good score done by Brian Tyler and Danny Elfman, with Brian Tyler doing some more original stuff and Danny Elfman doing some renditions of the Avengers theme, which I didn't understand why they didn't just bring in Alan Silvestri, since they reuse a lot of the Avengers score. So to wrap things up right here, I honestly don't think this is as bad as people are making it out to be, but it's also not as great as I thought it was when I saw it back in 2015. Because not all the characters get a whole lot to do, especially Thor. It's just not as grand or epic or quotable or memorable as the first Avengers is. And for being the shortest Avengers movie, it feels like it's longer than the last one, which is not a good sign. But again, the action's great. Ultron can be a very threatening villain. I absolutely love what they do with the character of Vision, played by Paul Bettany, who used to voice Jarvis. And all the scenes involving Vision are great. And it does lead to a very satisfying and funny payoff to the hammer lifting contest earlier in the movie. And I think everyone can agree, whether you like the movie or not, that that's a great payoff. So if I were to give a rating, I would say it's good. It's not great. Like I said, it does have some very mediocre stuff, and there's a lot of points in this movie where it does feel like a setup, but it's also a nice segue into this new era of the MCU, where most of the original Avengers are gone. There's a new Avengers team established, led by Steve Rogers, who has finally found his place. It's a great setup to Phase 3, and it just has some very good moments all around. And while it is somewhat an important film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, it is definitely not one of their best. Now, in terms of the Stan Lee cameo, this is actually one of my favorite cameos in the MCU, because it takes place at a party at Avengers Tower, where Thor brings this ancient Asgardian drink that he says is not made for mortal men, and he's hanging out with a bunch of old World War II veterans and Steve Rogers, because it would make sense for Steve Rogers to be in that friend circle. And then as Thor pours the drink and says this was not made for mortal men, we hear Stan Lee off camera saying, "Neither was Omaha Beach, Blondie. Stop trying to scare us. Come on." And then Thor and Steve are just like, okay. Then they pour Stan Lee the drink. Cut to the next scene where two guys are carrying him out, and Stan Lee just says, "Excelsior." So, I love that cameo. And then in terms of the stinger, there's only one stinger, and it's pretty much a no-duh stinger. It comes in the middle, and it's pretty much the reveal of the Infinity Gauntlet, as Thanos walks up, puts his hand in the glove saying, "Fine, I'll do it myself." And that's it. So there you go, that's my recap for Avengers Age of Ultron. It definitely hasn't held up over the past 4 years, but still, I think it's good. So next up, we're going to talk about the official ending to Phase 2 of the Infinity Saga, which is kind of an underwhelming ending to this phase, but we're going to talk about Ant-Man. This movie is more fresh in my mind than some of the others because I just rewatched it last year for Ant-Man and the Wasp, but I can't wait to talk about this one in more detail. Now I want to hear what you guys think about Avengers Age of Ultron. Do you like it? Do you not like it? What were your initial thoughts when you first saw it compared to now? Just let me know in the comments down below, and until next time, I hope you enjoyed this review. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give this video a like, and of course leave a comment. Don't forget to support my Patreon page, follow me on social media, and until next time, this is the real Mr. Robinson telling you, there's only one.